Good morning, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and welcome to today's video where I'm kind of doing something a little bit different. I'm going to be talking a little bit about some Cold War history. And the reason I'm talking about this part of Cold War history is, number one, I'm a pretty avid chess player, and more accurately, it's the 50th anniversary of this match. So, considering its importance, and it was actually played during the month of July and early August, believe it or not, I don't think it's nearly as important in regards to the Cold War as I think a lot of people sometimes give it credit for. I mean, it was definitely an inflection point, and it was kind of one way to manifest that the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the United States and the Soviet Union, were at odds with each other. But this match is a lot more interesting when you break it down and look at it on the human level rather than US versus Russia. That story's been told a million times over. I don't think there's anything unique I can truly add to it, especially because here in the United States it's seen as the plucky little United States defeating the overwhelming Soviet machine. And I'll kind of explain that because that does kind of factor into the human element of this match. But the importance is... And the accuracy of that comment is... Yeah, it's accurate, but not as accurate as some people think. So... let's talk a little bit about competition in the Cold War. While not nearly as high stakes as, say, proxy wars in Vietnam or Korea or somewhere in Africa, Cuba, Latin America, competition was absolutely a part of the Cold War, particularly from the mind of the Soviets. Here in the United States, we focused on the athletic. The Soviets, they focused on everything. They put equal emphasis on the athletic achievement as well as the intellectual achievement in competition. There's a joke, every Russian in chess, when you're talking about some topic or whatever, they always talk about every Russian schoolboy knows. And that should tell you just how much of an emphasis the Soviets put on it. And basically, every kid knew it. Every kid knew the game. Every kid was a decent player. All that sort of thing. But it's not just chess. The Soviet Union also focused on the academic. Their idea being that the more research they were able to do, they would be able to show off that the Soviet Union was better at producing athletes, intellectuals, academics, progressing human knowledge. They would be able to show they were advancing the athletic achievements of humans as well as the mental research and technological achievements of humans better than the West if they could outpace the West. That's why the space race was such a thing. Because the Soviets were out here chucking everything they could into space. Satellites, dogs, eventually people. Whereas the United States, if it wasn't on the battlefield or the stock market, if it wasn't war or economics, the U.S. didn't really place an emphasis on it, other than maybe athletics, because everybody wants to know who's the fastest, strongest, and who can jump the furthest. And where did chess fall in? Well, the Soviets, because the game is an intellectual achievement, supposedly only smart people can play it and play it well, which is completely untrue, but it's a myth that worked for the Soviet Union. Because if they could dominate this field, they would showcase that, look, we're good at producing smart people. Why can't you do the same? Oh, it's because your capitalists only focus on wealth. whereas we focus on things that make people happy. Okay, yeah, sure. We focus on improving the condition of mankind. Okay, sure. But, again, like I said, it's a myth that worked for the Soviet Union. And so, just like in every field, the Soviets built up a system that would, except for economics and, hilariously, the well-being of their citizens, they set up a system where people who were past their prime or had some unique knowledge were pushed into coaching, whereas the great talents who were in their prime would be competing against the rest of the world. It's just like, the military. Once you reach a certain point, you're not actually fighting. You're coming up with plans. You're coming up with better ways to train recruits, all that sort of stuff. So they took a very military aspect to sport. And I'm just going to say sport, even though I don't actually consider chess a sport, even though I'm an avid player, which is kind of unique. And actually, a lot of the prominent players, or not so prominent players, one of the only ways they could actually support playing in tournaments was being in the military. And there's some very interesting stories about some of this. There was one Soviet player who was threatened with a remote posting for the rest of his life in Siberia if he didn't place in the top 3 of a tournament. Anyway, let's get back to the 72 match, which is very interesting. By the way, likes, comments, subscriptions if you like the content of this channel overall. Please. But yeah, so that's the place of the game within the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union considered it very important to win and to dominate this game. Americans, we're fickle. If we're good at something, we'll pay attention to it. But the second we start not competing, we're like, okay, bye. A good example of that would be soccer. We only care about once every so often. One of those cases where we care is whenever the U.S. women's national team is playing, because they're good and they dominate. The other time we care is if the men's national team makes the World Cup or the Olympic team, or makes it to past the knockout stage, past the group stages in the Olympics, or something like that. In a tournament, we make it to the knockout stages. That's when we'll start paying attention. U.S. can be incredibly fair weather when it comes to support for something. And so when Bobby Fischer, an American, dominated 2 Soviet players en route to being the challenger for the world crown against another Soviet player, oh yeah, the United States was paying attention. But that's the thing. Up until Fischer made the world match, nobody really paid attention. Nobody paid attention. So now we get into the human element. Who are the players? And people know vaguely who Fischer was, but they don't really know much about his opponent. They also don't know much about Fischer to begin with. So everybody makes a point to state that Fischer was a bit paranoid. But it went far beyond that. He wasn't just paranoid. He was a conspiracy theorist. He thought the entire system was built to prop up some sort of Jewish secret society, and it was really weird. He thought that Jews ran the world, and he was weird. But like I said, he also was paranoid. He thought that people were constantly spying on him. And part of that actually probably comes from his upbringing. He thought there were listening devices everywhere. He thought there was, he was neurotic. He was legitimately crazy. And plenty of psychologists have tried to figure out what problems he had in his head. But I think I think anybody who has looked at his life can probably say that it was actually mostly a factor of his upbringing that made him the way he was mentally, and that it wasn't anything that he was born with or that developed of natural causes. But yeah, he was mercurial. He had an extremely short temper, mood swings, weird outbursts. He would demand weird things one minute and then the next be like, it doesn't matter, whatever. He was by far one of the most interesting personalities, but for all the wrong reasons. And he also probably wasn't all that good of an ambassador for the democratic capitalist West, simply because of all his crazy. Which makes it even better, because his team of seconds was just as crazy as he was. One of the most famous ones was one of the few other American players who could sometimes regularly compete at the same level as some of the top Soviet players. And that was William Lombardi, who was also a priest. And he was crazy. Like, not on the same level as Fischer, but he was very temperamental as well, and probably also lost his mind. But Fischer's team was very small. It was him, Lombardi, and maybe one or two other strong players. And a lawyer. Soviets, on the other hand, had a very large team. It was comprised of psychologists, lawyers, players, coaches, politicians, physical therapists and trainers. Yeah. And they were supporting the then current world champion, Boris Spassky, who basically was a complete opposite of Fischer. Though hilariously, also not who the Soviets would think of as an ideal representative for their way of thinking and their system. Because Spassky was never really political to begin with. Even though all Soviet players, just like all Soviet athletes, were expected to showcase communism as an ideal and beneficial system. Spassky was not really a politician. He didn't really care, and he was also a monarchist, meaning he supported a monarchy with, kings and queens and shit. But here's the crazy thing. When I said that Fischer and Spassky were basically complete opposites, Spassky was pretty stoic while Fischer wore everything on his sleeve. Fischer was known for outbursts and antics and wild demands. Spassky was a pure gentleman and a sportsman. And you'll figure this out when I talk a little bit about Game 2. because Spassky was not the type of person who would take take anything by default. He wanted everything to be pure, at least when it came to the competition front. And I don't care who you are, you have to respect that. And how did Spassky get there? Well, he was seen pretty early on as a crazy talent, and so they had him train under the best coaches available, play in tournament after tournament after tournament, developed him into a great player. They recognized his talent, and boom, they propped him up, because it would be a great tool for the Soviet Union if they dominated this field. Bobby Fischer wasn't well-to-do, wasn't poor growing up, and he had an affinity for the game, but no dedicated coaching. I mean, some, but like not nearly to the level of Spassky. And he played in tournaments, and he had to develop himself. He had to coach himself. He taught himself Russian just so that he could read Soviet publications, so he could keep up with their theoretical advancements, the games of their top players, etc., etc. And he had to make his own way in the world, and he had to make his own money, because he wasn't getting a stipend from the state, unlike Spassky was. So Fischer, in a lot of ways, represented the ideal picture of what Americans want to be, which is a self-made man. And you can read a ton about the annex leading up to the match. But let's just say we get to game one. Also, Fischer had just basically punked the entire world leading up to the match. Like, he dominated everyone he played in those candidates matches. 2 of those series of matches, he won 6-0. Which, if you aren't familiar, that's dominating. Back then, he won every game of those 2 matches. And he had won 20 straight at one point, which, at top level play, is incredibly hard to do. Like, winning 20 straight these days, you would get accused of cheating. That's how hard it is to do. And no one would believe you if you said you weren't, unless you were playing butt naked with no earpieces or anything and never getting up. That's how difficult it is to do, is that you would have to be playing like the ancient Greek Olympians in order to not get accused of cheating. But anyway, so you have the temperamental, moody, wild, insane, paranoid, self-made person against against the elder statesman. If it weren't for national pride, Spassky would have been much better looked at in that era, and I think more people would have seen him as a protagonist. Because if you actually read about him and read about anyone who's ever spoken to him or played him or been friends with him, that basically they all say the same thing, that he's the type of person who you would want to be around. Fischer pushed people away at every turn. So game one, everybody talks about this for one singular moment. And the truth is, that's really the only interesting moment of the game. The whole game leading up to that was just really dry, probably would have been a draw. And then Fischer comes up with this clever idea, thinking that he can win a pawn. But he doesn't really analyze it too far, and, well, everybody knows he takes the pawn and his bishop gets trapped and all that stuff. And they assumed that was the losing move. Technically, it wasn't, because Fisher did have a chance to draw later on in that game. And it would have been study-like if he had found it, but he didn't. And then, of course, he forfeits game 2. Yeah, so people were worried that he wasn't going to finish the match. Henry Kissinger supposedly called Fisher, talking to him about the national importance of the match and all that stuff, and Fisher didn't care about that. Now, Fisher's problem was that he thought that the cameras were distracting. He thought that the audience in the playing hall was distracting. He wanted it to be played in a back room where no one could see. Yeah. Now, the Soviet team, people helping Spassky in the match, they told Spassky not to accept Fisher's demand. They told him, don't do this, accept the win by forfeit, and we can complain, and we can say that the American player forfeited the match because after game 1 he knew he couldn't beat you, and that he tried to throw a temper tantrum, and that he is unbecoming of a player, and all sorts of other things, and get him thrown out from future competition. But that wasn't who Spassky was. Spassky wanted to finish the match. He wanted to play the match. He wanted to win on the board. That's his character. Now, supposedly, one excuse that was given was that he wanted to win on the board so that Fisher couldn't say, well, if he had accepted my demands, I would have won. Or that, Spassky only accepted the forfeit because I would have won eventually. Which is kind of hilarious, because Fisher had actually never beaten Spassky in a single game before the match. Basically, Spassky's argument was that if I don't accept, Fisher gets away. A reasonable argument. Because it's one of those things where if two things never, if an event never happens or it doesn't finish naturally, it's hard to say what would have happened. But anyway, game 3 happens because Spassky acquiesced to the demand it be played in a back room. And there's some good antics, because the players didn't know it was on a closed-circuit TV until Fisher saw the camera. So Spassky starts messing around with Fisher's chair and walking around the room all bemused and doing, normal person things while they're being impatient. Not necessarily impatient, but waiting around, right? Inspecting everything. And Fisher comes in, he throws some antics, and then you have a hilarious situation where the tournament director has to grab both of the players and sit them down. It's brilliant. And they play the game, and Fisher finally gets his win. And then the match continues normal. And then for Game 6, Fisher agrees to come back to the main playing hall, where he stays for the rest of the match, as long as the first couple of rows of spectators are cleared out, because he wants space between him and the people watching, because Fisher, like I said, the guy was crazy. And of course you see a bunch of antics where the players are just doing all sorts of crazy things. Like, one of the first things I read about the match was how Fisher and Spassky would both be wiggling side to side in their chair and swiveling them around. I mean, they were acting like children. But Fischer does something that he had never done before, and there's actually a hilarious picture in a magazine where Khrushchev, I want to say it was Khrushchev, was the Soviet premier at this time, is looking, is pictured with Spassky while Spassky's doing his prep for the match. And all the books are on a very specific opening move that Fischer always plays on move 1 is white. And the joke goes that Khrushchev says, but what if he plays this move? And Spassky's like, he's never done that before. He's never played anything other than this move. Well, guess what happens in Game 6? Fischer plays something different. And they get into actually a position that Spassky was a known expert, the world's leading expert in. And Fischer just demolishes Spassky. And that evens up the match score 2-2 because of Spassky's forfeit, right? And then things continue. One game, Spassky decides, we're going to go into one of Fischer's. Fischer was the leading expert of a different opening. And Spassky's like, I'm going to allow him to play that. And Spassky won. And so there was a little bit of a back and forth, but then Fischer started snowballing momentum. And by the way, a lot of antics kept happening, but most of them were kept at the board. And most of them were, of course, within fair play. No adding more time to your clock or sneaking time off of your opponent's clock, or no illegal moves that they try to play in order for their opponent to miss them or something like that. No, it was more of just acting silly at the board. But there are a few games from later on in the match that are interesting. But again, other than doing a score-by-score analysis where you're saying, okay, Spassky won this game, Fischer won this game, these games were draws. Once Fischer got an actual lead in the tournament, that was kind of over because Spassky never reclaimed the lead. And once you get a lead in a match like this, draws become a lot more valuable. So chess is one of those weird games where you can have a tie game. It's actually like football, American football. You can't have a tie game. The only difference is in American football, a tie is the exception. In chess, a draw is the rule. And in a match format like this was, where the first one to get 12.5 points, so a best of 24 match, it encouraged the player who had a lead, who had a lead in the match in terms of total points scored, draw being half a point, a win being a full point. It encouraged more and more draws, more and more solid play, because you don't have to beat your opponent every single game. You just have to beat them in more games than they beat you, until you get to the designated end of the match. So if you win one game and your opponent wins none, and everything else is a draw, that's just as much of a win as 13 wins to nothing. So, yeah. And this kind of leads to the sad part. So Fischer won, obviously, and then he, after a small tour where he played a bunch of simul's and toured America and all that stuff, and he was hailed as a hero. He retired. He quit. He refused to play the next World Championship match against another Soviet player, Anatoly Karpov. And some sources say that Fischer was terrified of this of that prospect. That he was afraid. He made outrageous demands, and one of them was a different format of match. And the format that he wanted was one where draws wouldn't count towards the final result. I think it was like he wanted it to be the first to 9 wins, but if the match is 8-8, the world champion retains the crown. It was a really weird format, but Fisher may have been right that the format needed revision. And I just because you're crazy doesn't mean you're wrong. And I think this was a case where Fisher's crazy was right. The problem is they tried to format like that later on, where only wins counted, and I think they made it like the first 2 X amount of wins. And the 1984 match between Karpov and Kasparov, and that match seemed like it would never end, and the match was abandoned, by the way, because the guy who ran the international governing body basically said, yeah, it's too dangerous for the players to continue. But yeah, so Fischer, of course, quit, disappeared for 20 years, and then they play a match in Yugoslavia, Fischer versus Spassky, the rematch, and Fischer just dominated Spassky. Problem was, the United States had an embargo on Yugoslavia, and so there was actually a warrant put out for his arrest. But yeah, it was an interesting event, and the truth is, it's just fun to talk about this, and it is the 50th anniversary, and it's an American win in the Cold War in a field that Americans usually weren't considered great at. To put it another way, the only top-level American players in regardless of era can probably be counted on one hand. I'm just going to double-check that. Morphy, Fischer, maybe Reshevsky, Caruana. That's pretty much it. Yeah, one hand. I can count the top American players on one hand. Unless you want to count 2 others. I count Nakamura, but and you could also include some people who have immigrated into the United States and now play as Americans, but I'm going to leave them out. Yeah, it's so Fischer's kind of an exception, and he did it beating the Soviet Union, as the narrative goes. No, he just beat one man who had a lot of support from his countrymen. And yeah, he had a smaller team, and he did most of his work himself. But I wouldn't call Fischer a hero. Nope. So anyway, I hope y'all enjoyed this lighter-hearted video talking about a slightly esoteric event that gets more credit for being important than it probably deserves. So take it easy, y'all. Have a nice day. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.